As we journey through Holy Week, we come to Maundy Thursday. As we gather in our own homes for this experience this year, you're invited to have with you something to eat and drink as we observe communion a bit later. We'll also be remembering Jesus washing the feet of his disciples. And you're invited to have a bowl or basin of water and a towel with you as well. Today is called Maundy Thursday because Maundy comes from the Latin word for mandate or commandment. On Maundy Thursday, we remember the words of Jesus from John 13:34 when Jesus says to his disciples, "I give you a new commandment or mandate that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you should love one another." The Gospels, called Matthew, Mark, and Luke, tell us that Jesus and his disciples gathered in an upper room to observe the Passover meal together. And at this meal, as they reclined around a low table, they would have shared food and drink together. They would have told the story yet again of how God delivered their ancestors from their captivity in Egypt. And this remembering not only kept this story alive and passed it down, but it also brought them strength and hope. Luke's gospel tells us that at some point that night, the disciples start arguing among themselves about who would be the greatest and most favored in the kingdom they thought Jesus was going to usher in. The gospel called John gives a story about a meal Jesus shared with his disciples as well that last week. The gospel says this meal took place before the Passover, but it's also quite possible this is the same meal the other three gospels refer to, just with a difference in remembering the time frame. In those times, everyone's feet would get dirty through the day as they walked on dirt roads and spaces in their sandals. It was custom that when you received guests for an evening meal in your home, someone would wash the feet of those arriving, removing the caked film of dust, dirt, and more from the feet of your guests gathered around the table. This was a task often given the lowest of servants or helpers in the household. But John's gospel tells us Jesus himself will take up this lowly task. Hear these words from John chapter 13, verses 3 through 15. And during supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin, and began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel that was tied around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus answered, "You do not know now what I am doing, but later you will understand." Jesus said to him, "You will never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." Jesus said to him, "One who has bathed does not need to wash, except for the feet, but is entirely clean. And you are clean, though not all of you." For Jesus knew who was to betray him, and for this reason he said, "Not all of you are clean." After he had washed their feet, had put on his robe, and had returned to the table, he said to them, "Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set you an example, that you also should do as I have done to you." As you hear this story, with whom do you identify? How do you feel? Peter resists Jesus' service of foot washing. Would you have done the same? Are you surprised that Jesus included Judas, the disciple who would betray him, in the foot washing? What would it take to offer a service of love to someone who hurt or betrayed you? What manner of love does Jesus model and command of us? You're invited, if you choose to do so, to remember in your own home how Jesus washed the feet of his disciples. If you're watching this video as a family or a group of people, you're invited to consider washing one another's hands with a bowl of water and a towel, or even one another's feet if you're comfortable doing so. If you're watching this video on your own, you're invited to dip your hands in a bowl of water, thinking about what it must have felt like for Jesus to wash his disciples' feet. Thinking about what it must have felt like for them to be on the receiving end of such an act of service. If you choose to engage in either of these ways, you're invited to either pause this video now or to engage in this remembrance as the song Jesus, Jesus plays. As we remember that meal that Jesus and his disciples shared, we also share in communion ourselves tonight. In our particular denomination, the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, it's common for us to share in communion together every time we gather for worship. This past year, as we've gathered online via Zoom and pre-recorded videos, outdoors in our side yard, and indoors in our sanctuary with precautions, we've been reminded that Christ's table is more expansive than we sometimes fully appreciated. When we share in the bread and the cup together, we are also retelling the story of how Christ has set us free. We are retelling the story of how Christ calls us together at a table with room enough for everyone. We are remembering that Christ ate with all sorts of folks in his ministry, and that we too are called to make room and space for everyone at Christ's table. We're remembering when Jesus wants us to remember him, that he gives us a meal that calls us to savor the good gifts of this life together. A meal that calls us to share with one another. A meal that calls us into community. Jesus chooses the bread and the cup, the most common elements of the meal, ones that were included even in the meals of the poor. At this table that stretches wide, and especially on this night, we stand remembering our past, faithful in the present, and hoping in God's future, proclaiming the Lord's death until he comes again. Certainly, we remember Christ's death when we gather for this time of communion. But what does a future rich in grace and hope look like when Christ will come again? What does this moment feel like, entwining memory, faith, and hope? The communion table, wherever it is found, represents an opportunity for reconciliation in the community. It represents an opportunity to give and to receive forgiveness and service, to hear anew our beloved story and to retell it for this moment. Mark 14:22-26 says, "While they were eating, Jesus took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he broke it and gave it to them and said, 'Take, this is my body. May you take, eat, and remember of your communion element at this time.'" The scripture also says that then Jesus took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, and all of them drank from it. And he said to them, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. Truly I tell you, I will never again drink of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it anew in the kingdom of God." May you take, drink, and remember. As we spend this time at the communion table in all the places it is found, we'll also reflect and remember through the hymn, "In Remembrance of Me." You'll see the words to the hymn appear on your screen as it plays. You are invited, if you would like and choose to do so, to sing along. Or you may simply want to reflect on the words and on this moment and be present in this time. Don't miss how this song reminds us so well that we remember the love Jesus shows us, not just in this bread and in this cup, but in caring for the sick, feeding the poor, and offering hospitality and welcome to our fellow children of God. This table reminds us of the command Jesus gave his disciples after their meal that night, after he had washed their feet. Love one another. May our remembrance lead us into deeper love and deeper community with all our fellow children of God. After Jesus and his disciples left that room and their meal, Jesus went to a garden called Gethsemane to pray. He feels the heaviness of what he knows is about to come weighing on him. Hear these words from Matthew chapter 26, verses 36 through 41. Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee and began to be grieved and agitated. Then he said to them, "I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and stay awake with me." And going a little farther, he threw himself on the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not what I want, but what you want." Then he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, "So, could you not stay awake with me 1 hour? Stay awake and pray that you may not come into the time of trial. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Many of us have prayed prayers of anguish before as well. How does it make you feel to know that Jesus himself knew the reality of anguished prayers, ones with a lump in your throat and an ache in your gut and what seems like a hole in your heart? Sometimes such prayers are prayed with words, sometimes just with tears and anguished cries. And it's immediately following this time of anguished prayer that Jesus will be arrested by those representing the Roman Empire and the religious leaders who had sold out for the sake of their own power and preservation. As the night goes on and starts to bleed into morning, he'll undergo a trial of sorts and be condemned to die at the hands of the Roman Empire, executed on a cross. On this Maundy Thursday, we remember Jesus washing feet, sharing a meal, praying with an anguished heart. And as we prepare to go out into this night, we'll hear the familiar tune of the spiritual "Were You There?" leading us into the cross of Friday that is still to come.
Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they crucified my Sometimes it causes me to tremble, Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they nailed him to the tree? Were you there when they nailed him to the tree? Sometimes it causes me to Were you there when they nailed him to the tree? Were you there when they laid him in the tomb? Were you there when they laid him in the Sometimes it causes me to tremble.